Welcome to the December quarter economic update. Will, let's talk about China. It seems to have had a correlation with the Australian market for many, many years, has an impact on world markets. What's the correlation? What do you see the impact of China in the next 3 to 5 years?
Look, the West has really doubted China for a long period of time. Market commentators have always applied Western way of thinking to China's growth, and they've been wrong for a very long time. China in 20 years has grown from an economy with very little significance to the world to an economy of great significance. It's number 2 and it's heading towards number 1 very quickly. China is now consuming over 50% of any resource that the world actually produces. So it's huge. And it's also trying to move from an economy of fixed asset infrastructure construction to one of consumption. So all Western economies, 70%, that's just us spending, consumer demand, actually drives economic growth. And China's growing towards that very quickly. What does that mean for Australia? It has huge effects. We are the biggest resource provider, but under the free trade agreement, there's also opportunities to use healthcare, education, technology, great opportunities ahead for us.
So China isn't just a positive for our commodity market. There's other markets that it'll also uplift just due to its massive impact.
Most of the growth of the world we see coming from the greater Asian region. Really, it's the only areas with population growth, the only areas where there's still that immigration from country jobs that add very little to the economy, into an industrialisation where your earnings can jump from $2,000 a year to $200,000 a year. I mean, that is great spending power. That really adds to the economic growth. So it's in the greater Asian region that we see that growth continuing.
Massive. Okay, Bitcoin. It's flashing up on all of our social media. It's coming up in newspaper articles. What's happening with Bitcoin? What's your opinion on it? What's the underlying future of Bitcoin?
Look, the underlying technology here is amazing. That blockchain technology, everyone needs to get a grip on that, because this may form the basis of all transactions, property, shares, any good or service in the future. So we do discuss that in the economic update. There's also the distributed ledger technology, and this is just an open book of transactions that forms part of the blockchain, and that's the technological foundation of what Bitcoin is. So it'll be very good after this economic update to have an understanding of how that all works.
So Bitcoin here to stay?
I think Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, apparently there's somewhere between 700 to 2,000 right now.
Wow.
And more is being developed all the time. So there's going to be more and more news and information about this as time goes on.
So in terms of news, the media is always having an impact on markets. What sort of weight do you think we should be putting in a lot of these publications?
Look, it's an interesting point, but we did have a meeting with the Deputy Reserve Bank Governor of Australia, Guy Debelle, and he said he never watches any media. He doesn't read newspapers, he doesn't look on the internet, he doesn't listen to the nightly news. He puts no value on those sources of information, and that's purely because the media's main purpose is not to give you information. You've never put in a check for $10 and sent it to Channel 7 and said, thanks for that riveting information tonight. The media is there to sell advertising space. So it always often gives a one-sided view. It often gives a sensationalist view to attract your attention. So because of this, our Deputy Reserve Bank Governor never watches it.
Doesn't even watch it. So what's the source of truth? What do you look for?
What we do is we get a lot of our information in our educational pieces from the Reserve Bank itself. We also get a lot from the actual heads of business. We have presentations from the CEO of Westpac, the Chief Financial Officer of Challenger Financial. We're out there talking to business itself. And I'm also very happy to read economic journal papers. We also have a team of about 60 analysts providing us with industry information, an economist, a strategist. These are the sorts of that we pull data from that we think clients can actually rely on and trust.
And straight from the horse's mouth of those corporations.
Absolutely.
So, look, when we see massive fluctuations, and it is reported on, and people get the heebie-jeebies with the fluctuating nature of stocks, what's really happening when we see a huge stock dive?
The markets, the Australian Stock Exchange is a clearinghouse. So you really need to think of that in terms of supply and demand. If the supply of a certain share, just like the supply of a particular commodity, let's take, for instance, I give a cattle example this time. If normally a farmer in his small town brings in 20 cattle to slaughter each year, that's probably enough to provide, lots of beef, for the town, meet a couple of months of demand. If that same farmer were to bring in 10,000 cows, then the auction house clearing mechanism there really has to drop the price quite substantially to get rid of that amount of volume. But the underlying beef demand of the town is probably the same. So it's always a question of supply and demand, particularly in the short term, whether it takes a day to clear, a week to clear, a month to clear, or sometimes even a year to clear. That's what trading exchanges like the stock exchange is trying to do.
So following on from that, 2012, 2013, massive drought in Queensland, huge issues with cattle, but it didn't seem to affect the beef price and certainly didn't affect the profitability of the local butcher.
Absolutely not, because the abattoirs and the way that is all set up, by Woolworths and Coles, they're controlling the flow of the end product of beef going out to the customer. But for the farmer, when the drought's on and they can't run cattle on the pasture, it's either try and sell it, or if they can't, it's shoot it. When the rains come back again, the live cattle price goes up through the roof because they need to restock. They need cattle, they need cattle breeding, they need to grow their herds, and there's also the underlying beef demand as well. So price skyrockets. So there's a very good example in this economic update.
So supply-demand forces does not reflect underlying value.
No, absolutely not.
There we go. Thanks very much. If you'd like to know more, there's a link with the full economic update below.